the Nether has terrified players for years, but it originated long before they were ever around. So join me as we journey back to its origins and discover the spine-chilling secrets that lurk within the fiery depths of the Nether. Our story begins long ago, billions of years ago in fact, back when the overworld was just a few hundred years old, and was very different to how it is today, as the overworld back then was very basic, as the spirit, or the god of the overworld, was still just learning how to develop its world. And so it was for that reason that this old overworld only had two biomes, the forests and the oceans. But in both those forests and the oceans, there was very little life, as the spirit had only really been able to make mushrooms and some small, boring trees. And so, due to that, the overworld spirit was rather, well, lonely, as he didn't really have any other life forms in his world to play around with, nor did he have any other spirits to just talk to. And so, the overworld spirit wanted to change that. Now, his first idea to fix this problem was to just introduce more complex life into his world, but that was way easier said than done, as even with his unlimited powers, it was going to take millions of years, if not billions of years, to create complex life. And well, he didn't want to wait that long, and so he resorted to option B. And so it was on one dark night that the overworld spirit began to cast a dark magic spell on himself, where he was going to rip 1/8 of his being out of himself to create a brand new being, a spirit, hopefully. And well, that dark magic spell was a success, and thus was born a brand new spirit, whom he called Nether. And so it was then that the overworld spirit finally had company and was happy. And so with that, it would be over the next few centuries that these two spirits would become very close friends, as they would work together day and night to improve the overworld. Now, most of the work was being done by the overworld spirit, but with that being said, the Nether spirit did actually make quite a few very influential creations for the overworld, such as fire, gold, and lava. And so things were going very well for the two spirits. Well, they were at first, as over time, having two godly deities in the world would cause the overworld to become unstable and begin to malfunction. This was very bad, and if it continued, there was a high chance that the overworld could be ripped apart and everything would be destroyed. And so there were two solutions to stopping this from happening. Option 1 was to kill the Nether spirit, and option 2 was to send the Nether spirit far, far away from the overworld. Now, the overworld spirit didn't want to do either of these, but he had to make a decision, and so he chose the latter option, as he just couldn't bring himself to kill his closest friends. And thus, the Nether spirit was sent hurling away from the overworld at millions of blocks a second into an area billions of blocks below the overworld. Now, the Nether spirit was very lost at first, as he had no idea what to do, as now he was just in an empty, dark space. But quickly, the Nether spirit decided that if he was going to have to be here for quite a while, then he might as well take advantage of it. And so with that, he began to create his own new world. One that he would have the responsibility to protect and control. However, this was going to be a very hard task to do, as he only had 1/8 the power of the overworld spirit. But still, that did not dissuade him, as he was going to attempt it, and he was going to persevere, and thus began the creation of what would later become the Nether. Now, to begin with, due to his limited powers, the Nether spirit couldn't really create something entirely new and creative. Instead, he just had to copy the overworld to an extent. But even that was hard to do due to his limited powers, and so it was for that reason that he had to make his changes within his world. For example, in the forests, instead of having grass on the ground, he had stones and dirt. And in the oceans, instead of having water, he had lava, as he had created the lava in the first place and understood it well. Also, he was unable to create a day-night cycle, and because of that, his world was stuck in eternal darkness, as it was stuck at midnight. But thankfully, he was able to change that darkness, as using some of his own blood, he was able to coat the moon up in the sky and give it a reflective red coat, which allowed it to glow red. And so with that, the Nether now had light. Well, sort of. Now, as for life in this new world, well, again, he had no idea how to create his own, and so he just decided to recreate the same creatures that the overworld spirit had created. However, at that time, the overworld spirit didn't really have all that much life, and the life that he did have was just too complicated for the Nether spirit. And so realistically, there were only two life forms that the Nether spirit was able to create, those being the pigs and mushrooms, and they each took a few decades for the spirit to recreate. But once they were made, the first phase of creation for the Nether was complete, and so this is what it looked like. Okay, so now let's fast forward a few thousand years to see what other new changes were able to be made in the Nether thanks to the spirit. And, well, there were many, as in that 1,000-year time period, the Nether spirits had never stopped working. So, firstly, the landscapes were now far more varied, as now instead of there just being a few islands dotted around the place in this world, there were now huge mountains, floating islands, valleys, geysers of lava, and so much more. Also, there were now many more blocks covering the Nether instead of just dirt and stone, as there were now many more variants of stones, as well as sand and gravel, which together made the land of the Nether seem a lot less repetitive. And the lava oceans were also going very well, as they were now placed to be at a constant level throughout the Nether, and the first natural forms of life were beginning to emerge from those lava oceans as well. But right now, those first forms of life were very basic, and they didn't really do much of really anything. But as for those other forms of life, the one that the Nether spirits had copied from the overworld, well, they had changed quite a bit. As those mushrooms, well, they had split into 4 different species due to some random mutations over time. And so there were now pockets in the Nether where each of these different variants of mushrooms would thrive. And they were growing rather rapidly at this point. Yet, still, at this point, all the mushrooms were around the same size, being no bigger than half a meter tall. But the pigs, on the other hand, well, they had grown quite a lot in size, and had also evolved to have a much thicker skin. And the reason for this evolution was so that they could have better resistance from the tiny embers that constantly blew towards them from the lava. And so it would be rather fair to say that what the Nether Spirit was doing was working rather well. Well, that was until one night when everything changed for the Nether. As it was on that night that the Nether Spirit decided to have a break from developing his world, as he had been working so hard for the last few thousand years, and that he wanted to go up and reunite with his friend, the overworld spirit. And so with that, he teleported upwards, going up billions of blocks, getting back to the overworld. But when he did that, something would happen, something that would be devastating for all life within the Minecraft universe. Because as soon as he arrived on the surface of the overworld instantly became unstable. But the Nether Spirit didn't realise this, and was just attempting to get up to the overworld spirit to talk to him, when the effects of this instability that he had caused became clear, as animals began to fall through the surface of the land of the overworld, and were beginning to head straight for the Nether. And he could sense this. Now, this would have been okay if there were only a few thousand doing this, but this was happening to trillions of animals in the overworld, as they were all falling through the world. And the Nether Spirit could see that the sky in the overworld was beginning to crack, and he could sense that this was his fault. Now, all of this was bad, very bad, not just for the overworld, but for the Nether as well, as the overworld was now crashing down towards the Nether because of all these mobs falling down and the sky cracking open. And if the overworld was to collide, well, both worlds would cease to exist, and thus both spirits would die. And so, thinking that he might be able to reverse these effects, the Nether Spirit decided to leave the overworld immediately. But it didn't work, as there were still trillions of animals falling down into the Nether. And so the Nether Spirit called out to his creator, the Overworld Spirit, begging for help. But nothing. Was he alone here? Was his world going to be destroyed? Well, thankfully not, as the Overworld Spirit was more than aware of this situation, as he, the moments that the animals began to fall from his world and the sky began to crack open, had been setting up a complex spell. A spell that would allow him to summon a gigantic bedrock ceiling on the top of the Nether. This should hopefully stop any mobs landing in the Nether and keep the Nether isolated from the overworld for the rest of eternity. More than that, the Overworld Spirit also moved the Nether even further away from the overworld. And then the spell was complete. Well, almost. As the Overworld Spirit did cast one more spell, and that was a spell to create specialized links between the two worlds. Now, this link would only be accessible through a portal made of obsidian that would have to be placed in a specific outline. And the idea behind it was that if things do go badly in the future and the creatures of either worlds need to be transported to the other dimension, then they could be safely. But at the same time, this portal would also be so obscure that no creature would ever find it. And so for this portal to ever exist, then the spirits would have to make it. Well, that's what they thought anyways. And so, once that was done, the Overworld Spirit and the Nether Spirit met up briefly, where they both agreed to never meet again, unless there was an immediate threat to the safety of either world. Now, this was hard for the Nether Spirit to take, as he had just been told that he wouldn't be able to see his only spirited friend. But he had to accept that. It was for the good of their worlds. And so now, the Nether Spirit would go back to focusing on his world, developing it even further. But right now, things were very different in the Nether than how they were just a few days ago, as trillions of life forms had just died in this world, and so there was quite the cleanup to do, as there was just so much blood covering everything in the Nether. Now, any blood that was left on the dirt or sand quickly washed away, but anything left on the stones, well, that was very hard to remove, as the blood just stained the stones, and there was no water in the Nether. And so the Nether Spirit made a decision to just leave it alone for now, with the idea that hopefully this blood would just disappear from the stones after a while. And so, because of this decision, the Nether was temporarily filled with bloodstone. Now, other than the blood that was covering the Nether, there were also the souls of these creatures that were now all over the Nether. And luckily, many of them were freed into the world and were able to rise up into the heavens. But many weren't so lucky, as billions of souls became trapped in the dirt and the sand. But now, despite all this death and destruction and suffering, some creatures actually survived that fall. And so all of these new creatures began to make their way over to those areas filled with dirt and sand, with the idea that hopefully there would be food there. Now, on the surface, this seemed to be quite a good thing for the Nether, having a whole new selection of giant animals in their world, as the possibility with them were endless, and it could potentially lead to the Nether having their first intelligent life form much earlier than the Nether spirits could ever make by themselves. And well, it would have been like that if it wasn't for the fact that the dirt had no grass in it, and so these dinosaurs had no food, and therefore they all died. So, in reality, this period in the Nether was rather dark, as there'd never been so much death in the entire universe to have taken place in just one location. But it wasn't just dark in the metaphorical sense, but also in the literal sense, as after all, there was now an unbreakable ceiling above the Nether, and so, due to that, there was no more of that red light coming from the moon into this Nether world. There was just thick fogs and shadows that covered all of it. And so it was for the first time in quite a while that the Nether was plunged into darkness. But, luckily, the Nether Spirit tried to fix this, as he spent the next few decades creating a brand new light source, which he called the glowstone, that he would place all over the Nether. And, thankfully, it would work, lighting up the Nether to an extent. And so now that we understand that tragedy, let's fast forward a bit, just over 100 million years into the future. And well, once again, it certainly was quite different, as now the Nether was far hotter. Now, the Nether has always been very hot, as it did have oceans made from literal lava, but now, due to the ceilings in the world, all that heat had nowhere to go, and so instead, it would just begin to heat up the surrounding areas of the world. And well, due to that heating, the Nether would undergo a number of changes. Firstly, the bloodstains on those stones, well, they became permanent, as the heat caused them to melt and fuse with the stones on a molecular level. And so, over time, the bloodstones have been transformed into a more permanent and stable combination stone, one that would later be given the name Netherrack. And so, because the Nether was almost entirely covered with these stones that had these bloodstains, almost the entire Nether was now covered in this Netherrack. But what happened to the stones in this time without the blood on them? Well, one of two things happened to them. Either they were heated up enough to be charred and thus became blackstone, and this happened most commonly in the areas closest to the lava geysers, and so that's where most of the blackstone was. Also, a unique feature of the blackstone was that it was able to absorb some of the heat from the surrounding areas, which is completely different to the Netherrack, which would keep heat at the same temperature, which is what allows fire to remain eternally on it. Now, on a small scale, this feature of blackstone was almost unnoticeable. However, as all these stones heated up to become blackstone almost instantaneously within the Nether, there was suddenly a slight cooling effect in the areas around the geysers where most of the blackstone was formed. And well, due to that shifting in temperature, the lava would suddenly solidify into basalt. And thus, that's how the basalt deltas were created, which is one of the 5 biomes within the Nether. Now, as for the other path that the stones would have taken, well, that only happened to the stones that experienced extreme high levels of heat. So high that instead of charring, they would melt and become almost a liquid that would become known as magma. Now, if that magma stayed at the same temperature and in the same place, then it would remain in its liquid-like state as magma. But if it was to move away and cool down, then it would become quartz ore. But that's not all. If that quartz had formed very low under the ground in the Nether and was in close contact with organic materials as well as diamonds that hadn't melted yet within the Nether, then they would all come together and fuse. Now, this only happened very rarely, as diamonds were very rare within the Nether, as they only came into it if they were being held by a being that fell down into the Nether during the Nether Spirit's visit up to the overworld. Well, not many were carrying diamonds at that time. And more than that, if the diamonds didn't fuse with the quartz and other organic materials quickly, then it would melt away and be lost forever. And so there really just wasn't that much time for the diamonds to fuse with the quartz. But that being said though, if all three of those resources are in close contact and are in the extreme heat and pressure of the Nether Underground, then they would come together to form the ancient debris. And that ancient debris, if processed correctly, can be used to create netherite. Now, quick side note, the only other ore within the Nether was gold, as that was the ore that the Nether Spirit had made so long ago in the overworld, and he still remembered how to make it. More than that, gold was also able to withstand all the heat within the Nether, and so it was for that reason that the gold was able to fuse within these new stones in the Nether. And so that's how the Nether gold ore and the gilded blackstone were created. So those were all the stones within the world, but what about the life forms, like the mushrooms? Did they do well over this time? Well, yes, they did very well over this time, as the fungi has grown a lot over the last few million years, to the point where they're now created their own ecosystems within the Nether, as the crimson and warp fungi had just adapted and grown so much to create their own forests almost of fungi, where they would both be thriving. And so now, how are the other animals of the Nether doing? Well, the creature from the lava had adapted to swim in the lava, and that's how the Striders came to be. Now, they didn't really do much, and they mostly kept to themselves, so there's not much more to know about them. But the pigs, on the other hand, well, they were not an isolated being like the Striders were, as thanks to the Crimson Forests, the pigs now had an abundance of food unlike anything they'd ever had before, which allowed them to evolve and adapt very quickly. But somewhere along this hasty evolution, the pig species split into two opposing species. The first were the piglins, and they were a much more humanoid species. And on the other hand were the hoglins, which were a much more wild species, to say the least. And they resembled something much more akin to their pig ancestors. Now, the piglins were much stronger and much smarter, as they, unlike everything else in the Nether, were able to create their own civilizations, and the structures that they were able to build from that civilization were actually rather impressive, as the bastions that they lived in were huge buildings that towered over the lava oceans, and in fact, at that time, were some of the largest structures in the entire Minecraft universe. And so, the piglins were thriving. In fact, life everywhere in the Nether was thriving now, as the Nether had never been better for life. Well, actually, maybe that wasn't the case everywhere. As, remember those valleys? The ones that were filled with dirt and sand? Well, they were nothing like the rest of the Nether, as they were a place of death and misery, as everything that resided within that valley was dead, as there were still millions of souls trapped within the dirt and the sand, which is where the soul sand and soul soil comes from, as those souls from the Nether Spirit's accident in the overworld were stuck in those sands and soils for all of eternity. But that's not all. Remember those giant animals, the ones that survived the fall but soon died in the valleys? Well, their skeletons are still there in the valleys, littering the landscapes. But their souls? Well, they were set partially free after dying. But I say partially because due to that ceiling, they were unable to rise to the heavens of the overworld, as they were just too big to fit through the gaps within that barrier. And so instead of rising up, they remain in the Nether, as their souls would soon gain visibility within the Nether, and they will become known as the Ghasts. Now, these Ghasts want nothing more than to just go home to the overworld and rise to the heavens. But they can't. And so, for the last few million years, without a portal, they've just been crying their eyes out in the Nether, frustrated with their entrapment. But as time goes on, they get angrier and angrier that they are stuck here in this hell. To the point where, if they see any being, they shoot them with their fireballs, hoping that the spirits will just accept the sacrifice of this random life and allow them to go free in their home world. But that would never happen, and they would remain trapped in the Nether without a portal for a very long time. But that would all change soon, as it was on one day that a portal would suddenly be created in the Nether. The Ghasts could finally go home, but no, as from that portal came the Skulk, and from that Skulk a new monster would be created in the Nether that was to ravage everything that's been built up until this point. But before we can get into that, we must first learn of the origins of the Skulk and how it came to infect the Nether. But to do that, well, it's actually quite a long-winded story, and it all begins with an ancient plant. Yes, a plant. But to learn how that's the case and how this links to the Skulk, then you'll need to watch this video.